Hey everyone, how are we doing? I am back in the booth here to continue reading within the book, in the book of the month, The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. We have read the perception portion, the action portion, and now we're into the will portion. And we also just got done completing the chapter on anticipation. So, before we dive into today's reading, if this is the first video that you're seeing of myself, so I have a YouTube channel where I read a book a month and I read and discuss the strategies and kind of the highlights that I find interesting and useful. And my hope is that you potentially would find that useful as well too, or something else within the book. I think reading is a phenomenal habit that everybody should be doing and a little bit of a lost art. So that's just for you to understand. And then with that, if this is the first clip, if you want to go to my YouTube channel, there is a whole playlist of the book, and you can literally buy the book and read along with me chapter by chapter, if you will. So that's the setup that we're working with. And with that also, I would love for you guys to subscribe if you desire to continue to read a book a month. I love people that read. I love people that keep an open mind, that are willing to grow. I'm not going to shove motivational content down your face, but I do think that every book has a chance to teach us something a little bit cool and unique to what we already know. So with that in mind, let's dive in, and we are going to cover the chapter called The Art of Acquiescence, I believe is how you pronounce it, or said another way, acceptance. I may read from the book a little bit more in this episode than I normally do, but there's just a lot of good stuff, so I want to cover it. So let's dive in. So talking Thomas Jefferson here, one of the founding fathers. He was born quite quiet and reserved. And a lot of people in this time period a lot of good leaders anyway, were very good public speakers and very outspoken. And yet Thomas was just not that guy, quite frankly. So he actually chose channeling his energy into writing, which others put an orator on instead. So instead of him being this very affluent public speaker with an orator, he became the orator himself. The cool thing about that, though, is that was where he found his medium. He found that he could express himself clearly. Writing was a strength of his, and Jefferson was one of the founding fathers turned to when they needed to construct the Declaration of Independence, and he wrote the most important document in our history in a single draft. So he wasn't a public speaker, right? But that doesn't make him less of a man, as this book and chapter is teaching us. And for others, Edison, Helen Keller, they had deprivations to their senses in some ways that did not allow them to be like everybody else. However, they accepted this, and rather than resent that fact, it allowed them to develop differently in an acutely powerful sense to adjust to their new reality. So in essence, what that's saying is that because they were partially deaf, because they couldn't see, because they couldn't speak XYZ, it empowered another sense in them and really made that useful. And so that's kind of the essence of what we're talking about here, the art of acceptance. It doesn't always feel that way, but constraints in life are a good thing. Constraints in life are a good thing, especially if we can accept them and let them direct us. They push us to places and develop skills that we otherwise would have never pursued. Would we rather have everything? Sure, but that isn't realistic. That channeling requires consent. It requires acceptance. We have to allow some accidents to happen to us. You know, you're not the only one who has to accept things you don't necessarily like. It's a part of the human condition. So everyone abides by this rule. However, we're introducing this strategy as kind of its own playing field of the more you can leverage accepting the art of acceptance, the better off you're going to be, because you're going to continue to redirect and continue to better yourself. So another portion from the book here. This is not to say that we allow it to prevent us from reaching our ultimate destination, but it does change the way we travel to get there and the duration of the trip. I think that's a huge piece. It doesn't change the fact that we are going after our destination or after an obstacle. However, it just simply redirects us to a place that we may or may not have considered. So you don't have to like something to master it or to use it to some advantage. With that acceptance, in terms of the shot that didn't go in, the stock that went to zero, the weather that disrupted the shipment. All of that is fine. All of that is what it is. Let's be clear. This is not the same thing as giving up. Very good point. This has nothing to do with action. This is for things that are immune to action. It's far easier to talk of the ways that things should be. It takes toughness, humility, and the willingness to accept them for what they actually are. It takes a real man or woman to face necessity. Great piece there. Great piece. In fact, sitting back on the sidelines above the rest of the bench let's pause and back up a little bit. So a little bit of a case study here for you. So in 2006, Lakers coach Phil Jackson had a surgery that really targeted his hip and kind of impaired him from being able to walk up and down the sideline as he was coaching basketball than he would like to. So this was a huge blow for him because that was kind of his coaching style at the time. With that, though, he was worried that if he had to sit down to coach, that he would coach differently. Interestingly enough, being able to do that actually increased his authority. He learned how to assert himself without being overbearing the way he had been in the past. But to get to the unexpected benefits of said, outcomes, we first have to accept the unexpected cost, even though we'd rather not have them in the first place. Things can always be worse. Yes. So essentially, once we have been redirected, after we've accepted something, that actually might benefit us or enable us to continue to do more of those things. Yes. And then a couple more pieces here. So it is very easy to internalize the assumption that nature has been domesticated and submits to our whim. Of course, it has not. And what that is referring to is, in our world, we think we can control everything because the technology has been so good, but this is saying that we can't. Sorry, that was slightly off topic of what we were talking about here in the Art of Acceptance. Okay, so we will conclude on this note for this strategy on a really good note. So, let me back up here. So people didn't always think this way in the way of today's world. The ancients who used a word far more frequently than us because they were better acquainted with and exposed to the randomness of the world and how events didn't go as we wanted them to. Events were considered to be the will of the gods. The fate were forces that shaped our lives and destinies, often not with much consent. Think of George Washington putting everything he had into the American Revolution and saying, the event is in the hands of God. Or Dwight Eisenhower writing to his wife the eve of D-Day, everything we think have been done, the troops are fit, everybody is doing his best, the answer is in the lap of the gods. These were not guys prone to settling or leaving the details up to other people, but they understood that ultimately what would happen, and they would go from there. So it's time to be humble and flexible enough to acknowledge the same in our own lives. There is always someone or something that could change the plan, and that person is not us. As the saying goes, man proposes, but God deposes. So all of that is to say, it's a great piece at the end of everything that we can plan to do intently, that unfortunately, sometimes it is the fate, sometimes it is the will of the gods. But we are robust and resilient enough to handle whatever occurs. You can't do anything anyways, and you're looking at the big picture enough and long enough that time will line up. Whatever you have to accept is still only a negligible blip in the way to our goal. Last quote on this is nature says nature, in order to be commanded, must be obeyed. So I know there was just a little bit of jumping around a little bit, but the strategy of will, or within will, and the strategy of Art of Acceptance can be its own little categorical piece to the pie, to when you've thought through everything, when you've acted through everything, when you've put forth all the will. Sometimes we just have to accept that things are the way they are, and it takes much more of a person to be able to do that rather than to try to find a meaning in everything. So hopefully this episode and strategy helped you out. Definitely leverage this immediately if you can. I love the idea of this strategy. I really do. So hopefully you guys again enjoyed this, and let's keep reading, guys.